Who was the most important person of the 20th century? Someone will say Lenin, others might name Roosevelt, Churchill, or Mao. Gandhi, perhaps, especially if they've recently rewatched a documentary. If the person isn't particularly interested in politics, which doesn't change the fact that politics is still interested in them, they'll say Einstein, Walt Disney, or the Wright brothers. All plausible names, all rather significant figures. But very few people understand just how many of our everyday choices, especially the bad ones, can be traced back to a man whose name is only known to a narrow circle of specialists. A man whose Wikipedia article is shorter than that of your favorite Instagram influencer, which tells you everything you need to know about what society chooses to remember or what it truly understands in the first place. This man never led a country. He didn't discover a law of physics. Neither did he star in a major blockbuster. But he helped construct an entire way of life. What you eat, what you drink, what you desire, what you believe to be your own idea. And most of the time, you'll never even know it was planted there. Among those in our lives whom we may consider to be quite bright, there's still a stubborn conviction that we manage our own lives, that what we do is exclusively ours, that what we choose is authentic. But that too is a product of suggestion, an illusion carefully maintained by people who designed the modern PR industry, the very industry that exists to tell you nothing is being sold and everything is simply part of who you are. In this video, you'll find yourself stopping more than once to think that this can't possibly be real. This must be fiction. It must be a coincidence. But it isn't. There will be no conspiracies here, no mysticism, only facts supported by declassified documents, corporate archives, financial reports, and academic monographs that most never truly bothered to read. Some of these stories are easy enough to find, but very few go looking. And even fewer inside the industry want them found, because if you understood how advertising and PR actually work, if you understood how deliberate it all is, you'd have to ask yourself uncomfortable questions, and that's bad for business. Today, you'll learn why people drink beer and eat bacon, why newlyweds buy diamond engagement rings, why your grandmother might have smoked a pipe, why Freud's nephew became the most dangerous man to never run for office, why propaganda doesn't just exist in authoritarian regimes, but exists most comfortably in societies that believe they're free. You'll also begin to understand how marketers have come to know you better than you know yourself, and what happens when powerful people gain access to your desires before you knew you had them. And yes, for those of you who watched Mad Men and thought it was fiction, there will be more than one moment where that lands like a punch to the ribs. Today, we will talk about how propaganda, advertising, and PR completely rewired our way of life. And at the center of it all, Edward Bernays, the father of modern propaganda and everything connected to the art of persuasion. A man who was born when Queen Victoria still sat on the throne and died as Clinton and Yeltsin were laughing on stage. Welcome to Double Agent, a channel revealing the truths they don't want you to know, or maybe just forgot to mention. Edward Bernays was born in 1891 into a family so impossibly complex, accomplished, and neurotic that failure would have been the only original achievement. His grandfather was the chief rabbi of Hamburg, a towering religious figure with a lineage stretching to the poet Heinrich Heine. Around the family table were doctors, civil servants, and writers. But the most faithful branch of the entangled intellectual tree was Freud, Sigmund Freud. Not just the famous uncle, a double uncle. Bernays' mother was Freud's sister and his father the brother of Freud's wife, which meant that before Eddie could even speak, his future was already being psychoanalyzed by the man who invented the term. At the very moment Edward Bernays was crawling beneath the dinner table, Freud, 35 years his senior, was publishing the earliest fragments of what would become psychoanalysis. The age gap wasn't just generational, it was civilizational. A few years later, Bernays' father moved the family to New York. He was a successful businessman, but by Bernays' own account, he was also a tyrant at home. Cold, rigid, difficult. Not abusive in the cinematic sense, no need for that, just domineering enough to shape a son who would spend his life trying to master perception, control narratives, and avoid being dominated by anyone again. At the age of 10, Eddie fell in love with reading. He later said it all began with a simple question no one wanted to answer. How does sex work? Asking your parents about how babies are made in those days was inconvenient, to say the least, so Eddie had to figure it out on his own. Whatever kind of tyrant his father may have been, he at least didn't spare any money when it came to education. Bernays graduated from a private school and earned a bachelor's degree in agriculture from Cornell in 1912. Later, he admitted that learning how to plow the land wasn't particularly useful to him. What interested him more was how ideas and words could plow human behavior, how opinion could be tilled, seeded, and harvested. One of his earliest jobs was in theater. On Broadway, he worked as a freelance press agent. The industry was still young, and the approach was basic. There's a new production, tickets need selling, let's beg the papers to mention it somewhere near the bottom of the Sunday Arts page. The actors are brilliant, the script makes sense, it's a show, that's it. Bernays, as usual, thought bigger. He shifted the focus away from the production and onto the story behind it. If the play was about how capitalists exploit coal miners, then the angle wasn't theater, it was economic injustice. The message wasn't that the acting was good, but that the play said something urgent about the American worker. If the story was about orphans, you didn't promote the performance, you promoted the idea that society has a duty to care for its children. Then, in an article about this topic, you'd casually drop the play's name 3 times, once at the beginning, once in the middle, and once near the end. PR professionals would later call this the poison sandwich. Wrap your message in something the public actually wants to consume, then slip the payload in the middle. A separate case was the Russian ballet, specifically the Russian seasons of Sergei Diaghilev. In Europe, the performances had already caused a sensation, but in America, the public saw little more than strange dancing, odd costumes, and difficult music. Bernays' job was to explain to Americans why what they were seeing wasn't nonsense. It was art. And so, he shifted the conversation again. He didn't try to convince Americans to like ballet. That would have been a losing battle. Instead, he positioned it as something that mattered to people who mattered. He highlighted not the choreography, but the names, elevating the perceptions of those dancers to that of cultural ambassadors. Vaslav Nijinsky, Tamara Karsavina, stars of the Imperial Russian Ballet, icons of refinement, of status, of Europe's elite tradition. The message wasn't, you'll enjoy it. The message was, if you consider yourself educated, You're supposed to be there. It wasn't a show, it was a signal that wasn't about understanding the art, but about not being the kind of person who didn't. A performance of your own taste. Step 2. Different stories for different audiences. You don't talk to everyone the same way. For women, you emphasize the elegance, the costumes, the fashion, the sophistication of progressive men. For others, it's the music, the glamour, the mystique. If the audience is simpler, show them a photo of the star dancer in a tight costume from Scheherazade, avoid the nuance, and focus just on the impact. Step 3. Work with prejudice. Don't try to change what can't be changed. Use it. One magazine refused to publish photos of the dancers at all. In their words, no editor in their right mind would approve it. The skirts were too short. It didn't matter that this was ballet. It was simply unacceptable. Bernays didn't argue. He adapted. He paid $600 of his own money, an enormous sum at the time, to have the costumes altered by the original designer. Longer skirts, more fabric, just enough to pass. It worked. Suddenly, millions of women across the country were seeing something they could publicly approve of. The press followed, and the taboo vanished. The tour lasted nearly 2 years, and by the end, America had fallen in love with Russian ballet. A conservative country had been softened through costumes, choreography, and careful messaging. Audiences that once saw it as foreign and indecent now saw it as sophisticated, modern, and oddly liberating. Today, that might sound absurd, but in the early 20th century, Russian ballet was nearly a sex revolution. Freedom of movement, of expression, of the body on stage, it smoothly slipped through the front door of American Puritanism dressed as art. But not for long. The First World War began, and America lost interest in art. For most of the 19th century, America lived under the Monroe Doctrine. In short, we don't meddle with you, and you don't meddle with us, especially in our backyard. European monarchies, with their problems, separate. The United States, with its democracy, also separate. In Europe, over the course of 100 years, there were more than 60 wars and uprisings. Despite its own civil war, America saw far less bloodshed. So when a new conflict broke out in Europe with brief chapters on other continents, a war that was supposed to end all wars, America stayed out of it. The country was largely neutral and generally pacifist. That changed when German submarines sank several civilian ships carrying American passengers, and when US loans to the Allies exceeded $10 billion, around $252 billion today. Loans that, if the Allies lost, would vanish. With that, the calculation changed. The US entered the war on the side of the Entente. Bernays tried to enlist, but poor vision kept him out. At first, he was frustrated. He went back to his usual work, like promoting the film Cleopatra, a production where the central themes were romance and sex. And to understand what that meant in 1917, consider this. Even in 2025, you couldn't run the film's original promotional posters as YouTube ads without violating platform guidelines. Imagine what it was like when those materials were printed in newspapers. A fixation on sex, desire, and glamour, clearly shaped by his uncle. Every time Bernays returned to Europe, he'd spend long hours talking with Freud. Despite the age gap, Freud was 57, Bernays was 22, the conversations were on equal footing. Bernays understood what Freud was doing, and Freud saw in his nephew someone willing to take those ideas into the public sphere. Bernays enjoyed promoting films, but the rally around the flag effect proved stronger. He wanted to do more, something useful. That's when old contacts introduced him to key figures in the Committee on Public Information. In reality, it was America's first propaganda ministry, and Bernays had just found his battlefield. The CPI's job was to explain to Americans who had spent a century under the Monroe Doctrine that isolationism was over, that everything was now for the front. It meant mobilizing public opinion, demonizing the enemy, and generating national unity on a scale that the country had never attempted before. In the end, 65,000 volunteers working under the CPI reached a country of 100 million, and they convinced it, largely, to go to war, thousands of kilometers from its own borders. Bernays remembered Broadway, but this wasn't theater, this was psychological warfare. Most of his colleagues didn't fully understand what he was doing. When he was assigned to work with Italian military contacts, others stuck to the script, repeat that the Germans were evil and had to be stopped, but Bernays didn't. Instead, he printed postcards not of enemy atrocities, but of Italian heroes, revered by America's Italian diaspora. Christopher Columbus, Giuseppe Garibaldi, not anger, pride, not hatred, identity, all for the sake of unity within the Entente. He called them paper bullets of victory. And they worked. And soon, the ordinary bullets too did their job. The war began to end. The countries started negotiating. Bernays found himself on the short list of 16 people selected to accompany President Woodrow Wilson to the Paris Peace Conference. Not bad for a 28-year-old PR man. When Bernays returned to the United States, something clicked. The war had proven that if you repeated the right message with the right emotional trigger, you could rally an entire population around an idea, even a war. And if that worked in wartime, why not in peace? Why not use the same methods on ordinary citizens? There was just one problem. The word propaganda didn't sit well anymore. After the war, the term had become radioactive, associated too closely with Germany, lies, and manipulation.
When I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
So he rebranded it. Propaganda became public relations. It sounded softer, more neutral, almost administrative. Consulting on communications. The techniques stayed the same, only the packaging changed. Important moment. If we break this video down into its most used concepts, into a sort of conceptual cloud, 3 words will dominate: propaganda, PR, and advertising. I won't launch into a long lecture about the differences between them. Instead, let's do what Bernays would do: establish a symbol. This is a Matryoshka doll, the kind that gets smaller with every opening. Propaganda is the largest one. It's the base. It means shaping public opinion at scale. Political, military, ideological. It's the architecture of mass persuasion. And inside it are all the modern tools we now call PR and advertising. Take out the military and political context, and what's left is a more comfortable version of the same thing: public relations. The same mechanisms framing emotional appeal, messaging, discipline, but used for brands, corporations, causes. It still conducts opinion, but usually in the service of a private interest rather than a national one. Inside that is the smallest matryoshka: advertising. Its goal isn't legitimacy or even persuasion in the long term, it's sales. Brand strength matters, but only insofar as it converts into revenue. Reputation, storytelling, ethics, those belong to PR. Advertising is about movement, money in, money out. And what's remarkable is that Edward Bernays, like William Gallas, who managed to play for Tottenham, Arsenal, and Chelsea, managed to play for all three: propaganda, PR, advertising. And he played each position with great precision. One of his first clients was a company that had invented frozen fish. In the early 1920s, the public didn't trust it. The idea that food could be frozen and still be safe seemed absurd to most people, so Bernays assembled a team of scientists and nutritionists to publicly endorse the new product. They published statements, gave interviews, pushed the health benefits, but the campaign fell flat. The story was too cold, too technical, too slippery for the public to hold on to. His first real success came with something much simpler: hairnets. You've probably seen them in old newsreels, women from the early 20th century wearing fine mesh nets over pinned hair. After World War I, they went out of style. The company making them came to Bernays for help. There was no market research, no one ran surveys, the logic was basic. Demand fell, so the product was declared obsolete. The company thought it might be time to move on. Bernays disagreed. He went to the chief illustrator at Cosmopolitan magazine and started a conversation about female beauty, and by pure coincidence, the artist happened to love the Greek hairstyle, which, as it turns out, was almost impossible to achieve without a hairnet. That was step one. Next, they wrote to hundreds of fashion magazine illustrators across the country, asking one question: do you find the Greek hairstyle beautiful? The answer, nearly every time, was yes. Then came the classic: expert support, press coverage, and newspaper placement. The story traveled through women's clubs, salons, and lunch tables. Slowly but steadily, the narrative shifted. Then, Bernays went to the New York City Health Commissioner, a simple man, not known for sophistication, but a man who loved attention. Bernays convinced him that hairnets were essential for hygiene, especially in food service. The commissioner took the idea and ran with it. He called press conferences. He urged his colleagues to adopt it. He made it a public cause. Then, by chance, absolutely free of charge, a senator from a small western state picked up the story. Why? Because women's hair kept ending up in a soup at restaurants. Momentum. Next, the US Secretary of Labor. Bernays convinced him that hairnets weren't just about fashion or hygiene, they were an essential safety device. In food factories, chemical plants, and textile mills, they prevent accidents. He agrees, and without realizing it, begins working for Bernays. Then came the cherry on top: humor. A launch was scheduled at the port of New York for a new barge. Bernays paid the stevedores to name the barge after Venida, the hairnet company. Then, they staged a press conference and delivered the final slogan: Venida controls the waves. Waves of water and waves of hair. Now imagine being an American woman in the 1920s. You've never heard of public relations. You've never been targeted by a campaign like this. But suddenly, all at once, every fashion magazine, every government office, and even the shipping industry is telling you that hairnets are the future, and so you go out and buy one, which is exactly what happened. Veneta's sales spiked, and Bernays walked away with proof of concept that people are very trusting, not to say gullible, but very, very trusting. Perhaps it was the authoritarian father. Perhaps it was all those long, quiet conversations with Uncle Freud. Or maybe it was just his natural instinct. But Bernays always looked at people from above. Take a farmer who raises goats and makes excellent cheese. Does he hate the goats? Of course not. He feeds them, tends to them, lives off them, literally and figuratively. But he also knows something without needing to say it. He's smarter than the goat. He doesn't ask the goat what it wants, he decides, and the goat obeys. For Bernays, the public wasn't all that different. And no, he wasn't a racist. In fact, in the 1920s, he supported organizations fighting for the rights of African Americans in the American South, no less at a time when for every activist there was someone in a white hood ready to retaliate. So it wasn't about race or religion or even class. The point was something older and, in a way, more dangerous. Ancient and modern philosophers alike have said it. Democracy is flawed. It's messy. It drags, it appeals to feeling more than reason, and it doesn't reward expertise. Even its defenders admit it's the least bad option, more of a compromise than a vision. And worst of all, it gives everyone a voice, regardless of whether they even understand the question in the first place. Imagine you're on a ship in the middle of a storm. Would you entrust the helm to a trained captain, or open the floor for debate, then cast votes on who should steer, when, and how? Even the founding fathers of the United States and all their revolutionary fervor didn't have power unchecked. They built a system of institutions designed not to unleash the masses, but to contain them. Perhaps that's why the American system was built the way it was, a complicated set of checks and balances, with electors acting as mediators between the people and the government. And yes, if they wished, electors could go against the will of the voters. Let's say, in 2028, Gavin Newsom wins California, but one of the electors, who in theory may be expected to give their vote to Newsom, decides instead to back J.D. Vance. That would be within their legal right, and this isn't exactly just a thought experiment. In 2016, it really happened. Hillary Clinton lost 5 electoral votes. Trump lost 2. Now, step back a century. In the 1920s, 1 in 4 black citizens in America couldn't read. Roughly 1 in 10 white citizens were also illiterate. Globally, the situation was worse. Still, 2/3 of humanity could not read at all. Now imagine you are Edward Bernays, not poor, surrounded by successful relatives, an elite education behind you. Was it not obvious that the public could be easily misled, that you could nudge them into wrong decisions or the ones you wanted them to make? To Bernays, the conclusion was logical. People had to be controlled, not through brute force, but through a softer kind of enlightened despotism. He hardly bothered to disguise it. One of his closest friends was Walter Lippmann, the great theorist of public opinion. Lippmann said the average citizen moved through life like a bewildered herd, stumbling, distracted, and drowning in complexity. His solution was quite blunt: the public must be put in its place. Bernays, with all the subtlety of a man nodding to the obvious, agreed, and then he set about making a career of it. Listen to what Bernays' own daughter later said about him. People working for him were stupid. Children were stupid. If someone did things not as he intended, they were stupid. This word he used constantly. Blockhead, stupid. The masses, they were stupid too. Naturally, his worldview was also shaped by Freud. After the First World War, Europe, especially Austria and Germany, was crushed by crisis. Freud's entire fortune depreciated in a single year. It was Bernays who stepped in to save him both financially and professionally, because Edward Bernays became something else: Freud's PR manager in America. Before him, Freud's writings were marginal, even dismissed as dangerous. But with Bernays' connections in medical and publishing circles, his work spread rapidly across the United States. Psychotherapy effectively became a new religion of the 20th century, but Bernays took it further. He didn't just promote Freud, he weaponized Freud. He took the theories of the unconscious, the symbols of Jung's collective psyche, and fused them directly into PR and advertising, blending subconscious desire and cultural archetypes into the machinery of persuasion. In the 1920s, Bernays exploded onto the scene as an established specialist with a portfolio that already turned heads. In 1923, he published his book, Crystallizing Public Opinion. 100 years later, it's still quoted, though often by people who clearly haven't read it. By the time he was 30, Bernays had become the great eminence of American capitalism. And, truth be told, he was lucky. The 1920s were roaring for a reason. The post-war boom, the stock market's rise, electricity spreading into homes, and a new national obsession with advertising. In short, the stage was set for a new kind of persuasion, an evolution of PR. Look at advertising before Bernays and after him. Before, it was a plain, practical, and a literal cause. You should buy this car because it drives well, because it's reliable, because it looks good. Bernays turned that logic on its head. He shifted the focus from the product to the self. Again, it wasn't "you should buy this car," it was "you'll feel better when you buy this car." This was no longer just mechanical buying and selling, it was personal, intimate. The act of purchasing became emotional, tied to self-image and satisfaction. And Americans were ready. Money was flowing, credit was easy, checks, loans, installments. For the first time, the United States shifted from a nation of citizens to a nation of consumers. Before, people wanted food on the table, shorter hours, and maybe a piece of land to call their own. Now, they wanted to buy things. The US Constitution promised the pursuit of happiness. By the late 1920s, happiness itself was being sold and delivered in packages, products, and brands. Even President Herbert Hoover told a gathering of advertisers, "Consumerism has become the center of American life. You are PR people, advertisers. You create desire." And so Americans turned into perpetual motion machines, running not on steam or oil, but on carefully rationed doses of happiness delivered with every purchase. Bernays used every tool of modern advertising. Popular actresses wore hats and jewelry only from the brands that worked with him. That's how product placement and brand ambassadors were born. The effect was the same as Gucci and Louis Vuitton today. First, the rappers wear it, film it in their music videos, and then teenagers dream of it. A funny case came out from a soap company, Procter & Gamble, for whom Bernays worked for almost 30 years. They had a problem. Children hated washing. Tear-free soap wouldn't be invented for another 30 years. The problem had to be solved here and now. Otherwise, sales would never grow. Bernays went to psychologists and came up with a trick. Sponsor a national soap carving competition, naturally using Procter & Gamble soap. Children love doing things with their hands, especially younger ones. Let them make miniature figures out of soap and subconsciously change both their own and their friends' attitudes toward it. I don't have exact figures on whether this improved hygiene, but it is known that in just 1 year, almost 23 million children took part. The company set sales records, and soap carving remains a popular hobby among American and not only children even today. In general, Bernays' relationship with hygiene was almost religious, literally. For example, Bernays was one of the popularizers of fluoridation, the mineralization of water. This is still done today to prevent cavities. Next time you buy a bottle of water, look at the label and say hello to Grandpa Eddie. Just in case, there's nothing dangerous about it. No need to panic like the general in Kubrick's Doctor Strangelove. The anti-fluoride movement still circulates a highly controversial quote, often attributed to Bernays. The public is ready to accept anything, because the doctor is an authority for the majority, regardless of whether he knows anything or not. Even if Bernays didn't say it, he almost certainly thought of it. And this mindset is shown most clearly in one of the most influential PR campaigns in history, bacon and eggs. A bacon manufacturer came to Bernays for help and asked him, as usual, to work his magic. Bernays looked at the standard American breakfast, at best, toast and coffee, at worst, nothing. Light, simple, and very, very far from profitable. Yet, people going to work before dawn needed energy. Folklore even said it. Eat breakfast yourself, share lunch with a friend, and give your dinner to your enemy. But industrialization had broken the pattern, and the morning meal had become thin. What did Bernays do? He went to his doctor friend and asked, "Tell me, which breakfast is healthier, a light one or a heavy one? The body loses energy overnight. Isn't it better to restore it in the morning?" The doctor answered, "Well, probably yes. If you restore energy in the morning, your health will be better for it." Feel the catch? Our body really does burn calories at night. If you eat a lot in the morning, you will replace those calories. But what on earth does that have to do with health? By that logic, you could start your day with a burger and fries. Even more calories. Even more health. Did Bernays conduct any kind of medical or nutritional study to back this up? Of course not. He simply mailed out 5,000 letters to doctors, carefully worded, leading questions, and received exactly the answers he needed. Then he blasted the press with the results. This wasn't science, neither was it sociology. It was raw agitation. And right on cue, the bacon manufacturer stepped in. The ground was already fertilized. The message was simple. Here's the real American breakfast: hearty bacon. Eat it with your eggs. Fuel your energy. Within 6 months, bacon sales shot into the stratosphere, and from there, the obsession spread worldwide. Today, there are not one, not two, but three international bacon days in August, September, and December, three separate occasions every year to celebrate fried pork. Just think about it. If turkey producers had hired Bernays instead, the classic American breakfast might have been turkey meatballs, or sausages, or even something else entirely. But the bacon story, astonishing as it is, will feel like child's play compared to what came next. In the late 1920s, Bernays began working with tobacco manufacturers. Around the same time, humanity discovered ultraviolet rays, and the world rushed to treat them as something magical. Lamps that now gather dust in your grandmother's attic were once snapped up by everyone. But even then, whispers were growing. People were starting to suspect that smoking didn't just correlate with cancer, it actually caused it. Freud himself, who never took a cigar out of his mouth, spent the last years battling jaw cancer. The tobacco companies needed a distraction. Their answer? Ultraviolet light. Fans of Mad Men might remember the very first episode when Don Draper is told to brand Lucky Strike cigarettes as it's toasted. The trick was simple: pretend the process was unique and imply it made the cigarettes safe. Other cigarettes were whispered about as harmful, but Lucky Strike was sold as almost healthy. The ultraviolet campaign followed the same playbook. Lucky Strike began exposing its tobacco to UV lamps during processing, then launched the slogan, "Light softens, heat cleanses." Lucky Strike, protection for your throat, protection from coughing. Now it could not be more clear that this was a blatant lie. But at the time, it worked. Half of the country smoked, and yes, even women, only they did it quietly, at home. In restaurants and cafes, you would never see a woman with a cigarette. Female smoking was treated as vulgar, shameful. In fact, in 1908, New York authorities had banned women from smoking in public altogether. But by the 1920s, as society loosened, Lucky Strike saw an opportunity. The challenge was simple but daring: how to make women smoke openly, on the street, in cafes, until cigarettes stopped being a guilty secret and became a visible symbol, passed from one woman to the next. And they came to Bernays for advice. He did not let them down. He was never embarrassed to ask for guidance from people more competent in narrow fields. This time, he turned to a psychoanalyst. The specialist told him smoking is a sublimation of oral eroticism. The first woman who smoked probably knew very well that the act has a physical, sensual element, but she smoked anyway. And now he explained to Bernays, look at what's happening in our society. Women are working the same jobs as men. They are having fewer children. They are allowed to vote. These, dear Mr. Bernays, are no longer just cigarettes. These are torches of freedom. Bernays seized on the phrase and went to work. He carefully selected women who weren't model perfect, enlisted the support of feminist Ruth Hale, handed out cigarettes, and organized a women's rights rally in the center of Manhattan. As they marched and smoked, Bernays' own photographers and reporters, sent in advance, captured the moment. He personally chose which images were sent to the newspapers. 10 women smoking for their rights shook the entire nation. From California to Florida, America started talking of nothing else for a month, and Lucky Strike was riding high. They changed their packaging to match fashionable colors among women and rolled the media machine into action. The old prejudice had collapsed. Take a Lucky instead of a candy. Want a slender look? No one will stop you. Lucky Strike. Both slogans doubled as diet promises and cigarettes as replacements for snacks. Sales hit records. By the 1970s, there was one female smoker for every 2 men. Soon, female smoking carried a new image: the femme fatale, beautiful, sexy, and what we'd now call empowering. But there was one problem. In 2012 alone, 500,000 women died of lung cancer worldwide. Stretch that number across a century, and the victims of female smoking reach into the tens of millions. So much for Edward Bernays' concern for the nation. To twist feminism into that kind of sales pitch, you really had to try. After these campaigns, every advertiser understood that psychology and emotion must sit at the center of marketing. And with that foundation set, let's examine the craziest ideas of Bernays' own students. Men, perhaps not all living, will relate here. When we find ourselves among other men, we start competing almost by instinct. Sometimes it's logical: money, strength, endurance. Sometimes it's quite ridiculous. Take cars, for example. If your friends find out you can't even change a tire, you'll never hear the end of it. What kind of man doesn't know how to handle his own car? It works everywhere. Think of the unwritten championship of masculinity that comes with the barbecue. A man might not know how to cook anything else, but meat on a grill, this is sacred. The same is true with the lawn. If the grass in front of your house is overgrown, what kind of man or what kind of owner are you? 100 years ago, Marlboro cigarettes weren't even aimed at men. They were made for women because they had filters. Real men, it was thought, smoked unfiltered cigarettes. After the 1960s, though, the industry had a problem. The evidence of cancer was piling up. People were dying in droves. Even the tobacco barons understood that either they switched their customers to filters, or they will be lost to the point where the entire business would collapse. But how do you solve the problem of filters being seen as feminine? You press the masculine button. Another very influential PR man, Edward Bernays, came up with the Marlboro Cowboy, also known as the Marlboro Man. The brand managed to connect two completely different worlds. On one hand, the essence of freedom and independence, and on the other, a harmful piece of paper with nicotine. The campaign worked like a charm. The cowboy was everywhere. On posters, on billboards, in magazines. Many of the ads didn't even bother with slogans. just a smoking cowboy. No rational arguments that filters were safer. And it worked. Filter cigarettes became masculine. Marlboro became the sales leader, even in international cinema. From Britain, France, and even the Soviet Union at the time, there was hidden product placement for Marlboros. And then came the cruel irony. The very first cowboy who sold the coolness of smoking got cancer. 20 years later, he was convincing the nation to quit by his own example. By the 1950s, the lesson was obvious. Every advertising agency needed its own team of sociologists and psychologists. The sociologists would run in-depth interviews and focus groups to find out what consumers wanted. The psychologists had to dig even deeper. One of my favorite stories is about a dry cake mix from General Mills. You took a bag, added water and oil, put it in the oven, and out came a ready-made cake. In the 1930s, this was a novelty. Housewives and focus groups squealed with delight at the idea, but when the company released the product, sales barely moved. Marketers for a long time couldn't understand what was happening, and psychologists helped. They suggested that women experienced subconscious guilt when they served their husbands not a real cake, but a semi-finished product. It's like inviting guests and ordering delivery. Many still consider this almost rude. The solution was simple. Remove the egg powder from the mixture so that housewives would add a real egg themselves. That one action became the main feature of the entire product. Not a lazy semi-finished product, but a quick dish made with love. Sales skyrocketed. You may think you know yourself, but marketers know you better. Is that bad? Why should it be? Husbands are happy, housewives save time, and business thrives. Welcome to capitalism. Or maybe, how about a beer? We hear this phrase all the time from coworkers, friends, even old acquaintances we haven't seen in years. Well, yes, it's alcohol, but not vodka. Having a pint or two at a bar is always nice, especially when they start telling you about the notes of roasted barley and coffee in a Guinness. One glass or bottle wouldn't hurt. It's not beer that ruins people, and besides, I'm not a beer alcoholic like Peter Griffin. And right there, you've fallen. Again, for the bait of Bernays and his students. After Prohibition was repealed, alcohol still carried the stink of sin. Years of propaganda sobriety don't just vanish overnight. Beer producers grew nervous. If public opinion turned again, beer could go the way of bootleg liquor and disappear. So they turned to Bernays, not to sell more, at least not just yet, but to rehabilitate their image. Bernays did what he always did. He borrowed authority. He lined up historians and economists, and together they repackaged beer as something different. Not reckless, not ruinous, not immoral, but discreet. The civilized man's drink. He called it exactly that, a discreet drink. Strong liquor was for special shops, hidden behind counters. Beer, by contrast, was rebranded as the respectable fellow's drink, the companion of conscious citizens who only wanted to brighten up their evening without frightening the horses. Thanks to Bernays, it soon left the gloomy liquor store and strutted proudly onto ordinary grocery shelves. He even pumped it full of patriot symbolism. The founding fathers, he reminded people, drank beer. And just look at the nation they've built. Today, that historical footnote is forgotten, but the easy, almost light-hearted attitude toward beer has stayed. Globally, it's the world's favorite alcohol, beating both vodka and wine. And in America, it's not just a drink, it has firmly established itself as a cultural institution. As any college student juggling their GPA with eternal rounds of beer pong, it's table tennis, but with red plastic cups. And the prize is a hangover. PR, of course, doesn't always end in death tolls. Some campaigns were almost charming. Take Michelin stars. They weren't born in some temple of French gastronomy. They came from a tire company. Yes, the very one with the flat white mascot. Michelin originally published a travel guide to tell motorists where to eat, sleep, and park. But by the 1920s, the star rating shifted to restaurants. Today, the stars are more famous than the tires, which proves there are fewer limits to human gullibility than to the French menu. And then there's Santa Claus. Before Coca-Cola's genius meddling, he was a lanky fellow in green wandering about like a Victorian garden gnome. Coca-Cola dressed him in red, gave him a belly and a smile, exported him to every chimney in America, and from there to the world. And then there are diamonds. For centuries, they were just stones. De Beers spent decades fabricating a myth that diamond engagement rings were an ancient tradition. By the time the slogan, "A diamond is forever," appeared, the lie had hardened into fact. Even James Bond was brought in to help. By the 1980s, diamond sales in the US had rocketed from 23 million to 2 billion. A fine return on something dug out of the ground and sold back as eternal love. It's crazy, yes, and these are only the brightest cases from Bernays' disciples. Propaganda fused with psychoanalysis had managed to turn citizens into consumers, obedient enough to think they were free while dutifully wanting exactly what they were told to want. But the danger grew far greater when the same tools were harnessed for intentionally darker purposes. And Bernays himself was not entirely absent from that stage. Even in his youth, the father of PR worked part-time as a political strategist. One of his clients was President Calvin Coolidge, a man who could win over Congress but not the crowd. He had the nickname to prove it, Silent Cal. What did Bernays do? He dug up his Broadway contacts and invited them all to breakfast with the president. The image was perfect. The nation thought Coolidge was humorless, an emotionless man with the warmth of a poker face. And who could soften that better than stars of the stage? The next day, the newspapers ran the story. Coolidge, of all people, had shared a meal with theater celebrities. He even smiled, maybe laughed. However sarcastic the coverage, Coolidge's rating ticked upward. It was the first real presidential PR stunt in American history. And from that moment, such meetings with the cultural elite became a standard trick in politics. For them, prestige. For presidents, a borrowed share of their popularity. Bernays later wrote about this in his next book, which became a classic, Propaganda, published in 1928. Together with Harold Lasswell's techniques of propaganda in the World War, it became a manual: how to manipulate opinion by probing fears and desires, how to turn psychology into politics. And guess, just guess, which German political leader really liked it? Both Hitler and Goebbels admired Bernays. In 1933, Goebbels even showed an American journalist his library. Among the works that lined the shelves, the books of Edward Bernays, Freud's Jewish nephew, stood out. By a grim irony, those very texts, alongside others, helped give the Nazis the keys to the machine of Hitler's propaganda. Bernays had published propaganda 10 years after the First World War. The Germans, of course, had learned their lesson. Their wartime propaganda had been weak, clumsy, and pale, more likely to provoke resentment than enthusiasm. This time, they studied the victors. They studied Britain. The Nazis adopted symbols and slogans, short, repeatable, and everywhere. Greetings, swastikas, salutes turned into beacons for ordinary Germans, who gradually soaked in the new reality. People once indifferent to Nazism began to line up, literally and figuratively, behind the party. Censorship and repression did the rest. It was Freud by other means. Love and devotion sublimated into worship of the Führer. Aggression redirected towards outsiders and enemies. Engineering consent, Bernays' phrase, his proud concept, became the operating principle. Propaganda, he argued, was man-made, a tool to shape societies, and in his notes, he had warned that it should only be used by educated professionals. The flaw in that argument is obvious. Professionals can be scoundrels too. Bernays was horrified to learn that his books had become reference manuals for the Reich. He understood, at last, that propaganda is like a weapon. In the hands of terrible men, it guarantees terrible results. However, during the war, he began to emphasize that propaganda should be grounded in the principle of democracy and freedom, so that madmen like Hitler and Goebbels could no longer convince an entire nation that war and genocide were normal. A noble position, of course, but hardly flawless. After all, it does not require great wisdom to refuse a contract with Hitler, and yes, he was offered one. And what, then, of Franco's Spain, which implemented its own version of fascism? On this, Bernays took a simple position. I am an American, therefore I support the Americans. He turned down every invitation to work from Madrid. As we've established, Bernays could not fight due to his health, and during the Second World War, he headed departments and propaganda committees, drafting motivational essays and produced morale-boosting materials. Useful, but not the stuff of medals. His real impact came later. By the 1950s, it was in his 50th year when he would repay his debt to his homeland in a way that changed history. In Central America lay one small, unremarkable country, Guatemala. Bordering Mexico to the north, its main export was bananas. Even today, bananas remain its lifeline. In short, a classic banana republic. Bernays was consulting for the United Fruit Company, or UFC, the largest banana empire of the age. At first, his job was mundane: boost banana sales in the United States. Classic product placement, health articles, a steady drip of bananas are good for you, routine PR, but in the 1950s, everything changed. Guatemala's democratically elected president began pursuing reforms that cut directly into UFC's profits. First came agrarian reforms, redistributing almost 1,000 square kilometers of UFC land to peasants. Then legalization of left-wing parties. And worst of all, workers gained the right to strike, something unheard of in the last 50 years. And they used it. For UFC, this became existential. Lower profits, higher wages, concessions. It was an unacceptable future. So they turned to Bernays. Gentlemen, this is the Cold War. The American public fears nothing more than the Soviet bomb. If Guatemala is allowed to become communist, then just 1,000 kilometers from our border, a hostile state will bloom. Shout it for the rooftops. America must get involved and set things straight. When the situation escalated, Bernays, this time working hand in glove with the CIA, rolled out a PR campaign that painted UFC bananas as victims of communism itself. The Marlboro Man once hid the dangers of cigarettes. In Guatemala, Bernays hid the dangers of corporate overreach. It was no longer about a company clashing with a left leaning government. It was framed as a threat to US national security, to democracy itself. Bernays assembled a team of American journalists and shipped them south, and in his memoirs, he insists they were free to film and write as they pleased. The testimony of other witnesses tells a different story. Everything the journalists saw followed a script carefully staged by the Banana Kings. Even the so-called violent anti-American rallies were part of the production, organized by Bernays himself. After this orchestration came the finale, a CIA-backed coup. The elected government was toppled, a right-wing general installed, and the UFC got back everything it had lost. I would like to tell you this is just conspiracy talk, but the declassified CIA archives leave little room for any doubt. As for Bernays, it's impossible to put a price on his career. One contract with the banana magnates alone earned him $100,000 a year, over $1 million in today's money. At his peak in the 1920s and 40s, his advertising clients surely paid far more. He lived to 104, dying in 1995, long after his world had already become ours. In his final decades, in a large Victorian house outside Boston, he still tinkered with memoirs, still gave interviews, still remembered names and details from half a century before. Contemporaries say he wasn't charismatic, not even particularly engaging one-on-one. Small talk wasn't his arena. Bernays thought in categories, too large for any of that. For him, propaganda was the antidote to chaos, and, in truth, it is hard to imagine the modern world without it. Every day we encounter it not always as politics, but as lifestyle campaigns. Safety reminders, endless sales, charity drives, YouTube videos, television stories. Fighting propaganda is as futile as fighting television itself. The only defense is to approach information critically in the world that Bernays and his students built. And if you find yourself thinking, how could people have possibly fallen for any of this? How could they believe that cigarettes soothe the throat, or that breakfast was incomplete without bacon and eggs? Remember the context. To Bernays' audiences, PR and advertising were invisible forces. The field was new, almost alien. Only a generation earlier, many had never seen electricity, skyscrapers, or cars. In such a world, suggestion worked like magic. Everything was new. Bernays always contrasted propaganda with chaos. It is simply impossible to imagine the modern world without propaganda. We encounter propaganda many times every day, and this is not always politics in its purest form. Healthy lifestyle, compliance with traffic rules, endless sales, donations to charity, videos on YouTube, stories on TV, it's all propaganda. Often, people didn't realize they were being manipulated. They took everything at face value. Condemning them for it would be unfair, and yet many of Bernays' techniques, adjusted only slightly for modern platforms, would still work seamlessly today. Because then, as now, the real commodity isn't the soap, the cigarettes, or even the bacon. The product is your attention and your time. And on that note, I'm grateful you've given some of your time to this video on a figure as controversial as Edward Bernays, a man whose legacy is impossible to separate from the very world we live in. No matter which way you look at him, flawed, manipulative, or brilliant, he was undeniably a great man.